For centuries, the dominant scientific view has been that consciousness is a byproduct of the brain, an illusion created by neurons firing in just the right way and vanishing at death like smoke dissipating into the air. But what if that view is wrong? What if consciousness is not trapped inside the skull but extends beyond the body, capable of reaching across space and time? What if the mind can move objects, sense the future, and communicate at a distance, not metaphorically, but literally? Modern science tells us these things are impossible. Consciousness, we're told, is nothing more than a side effect of the brain's electrochemical activity, locked inside the skull, powerless to affect the world around it. And yet, the evidence tells a different story. Experiments in telepathy, psychokinesis and precognition have been rigorously tested, documented and replicated. The results defy materialist expectations, but rather than investigating these anomalies, the scientific establishment ignores them because to accept them means admitting that consciousness cannot be contained within the current paradigm, and yet reality is not bound by the dictates of any paradigm, even a scientific one, and will not conform to a cherished set of beliefs just because scientists want it to. If the mind reaches beyond the body, if thoughts can influence matter, and if consciousness survives beyond space and time, then our understanding of reality is fundamentally incomplete. What we need is a new paradigm, one that does not dismiss evidence simply because it doesn't fit within a rigid, outdated model of reality. But where do we look for such a paradigm? One approach is to follow the cracks, to examine the places where the scientific worldview fails to explain the data. But there is another approach, one that might seem controversial but is no less reasonable. If consciousness is not limited to the physical world, then intelligence need not be either. If the mind exists beyond time and space, then why wouldn't it be possible to gain insight from an intelligence that does not belong to our physical reality? This brings us to Seth, a source of knowledge unlike any other. In the 1960s through to the 80s, Jane Roberts, a writer and poet, began experiencing unusual states of consciousness. She would enter a light trance, and from this state she began speaking not in cryptic messages or riddles, but in fluent, articulate monologues that explored the nature of reality with a depth and coherence unlike anything she had encountered before. Her husband, Robert Butts, transcribed every word by hand, meticulously recording these sessions. Over time, thousands of pages of material were produced, detailing a profound new understanding of consciousness, time, multidimensional reality, and human potential. This intelligence identified itself as Seth. Unlike fleeting messages from trance mediums or automatic writing, Seth's words formed entire books, dictated over 2 decades in a structured, coherent manner. He spoke of multiple dimensions of reality beyond the physical, the fluid nature of time, the creative power of thought, and the interconnectedness of all life. But perhaps most importantly, Seth directly challenged the materialist model of consciousness. He insisted that the mind does not emerge from the brain, but rather the brain acts as a receiver of consciousness, a focal point for awareness that already exists beyond space and time. At the time, these ideas were radical. Today, they align with some of the most cutting-edge discoveries in quantum mechanics, neuroscience, and psi research. If modern science is struggling to explain the anomalies of consciousness, perhaps it is time to consider a broader framework, one that accommodates the evidence rather than discarding it. Seth provides exactly that. And if his perspective is correct, then the mind is far more powerful than we've been led to believe. So let's begin. Psychokinesis, or PK, is the ability of the mind to influence matter without direct physical contact. Sounds like science fiction, right? A trick you'd expect from a stage magician, not a real-world phenomenon. But in 1989, researchers Dean Radin and Roger Nelson decided to take a closer look at the data. They conducted a meta-analysis of over 800 PK studies testing the reality of psychokinesis, spanning nearly 3 decades. The odds against chance? Over 1 trillion to 1. If these results had appeared in any other scientific field, they would have been considered irrefutable. But because PK challenges the foundations of materialism, it remains one of science's most inconvenient truths. Seth was clear on this point. Thoughts are not passive. They have structure. They interact with reality, and under the right conditions, they shape the physical world itself. So how do we test something like this? One way is to see whether consciousness can influence quantum events, specifically the famous double-slit experiment. The double-slit experiment is a cornerstone of quantum mechanics. It demonstrates that light behaves as both a particle and a wave, depending on whether or not it is observed. But what happens if human intention is introduced into the equation? Dean Radin set up an experiment where subjects were asked to mentally influence which slit a beam of laser light passed through. The results showed that their intentions changed the pattern of the photons, altering the wave function collapse. But that was just the beginning. In 1998, psychologist Dick Bierman took things further. Instead of testing whether consciousness could influence the present, he wanted to see if it could reach backward in time and alter the past. The experiment was simple but mind-bending. A computer randomly generated strings of ones and zeros and stored them on a hard drive, unobserved. According to the standard Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, these numbers should remain in an undefined state of superposition until someone looked at them. Then came the twist. Subjects were brought in after the numbers had already been recorded and were asked to mentally aim for ones or aim for zeros. If consciousness had no retroactive effect, their efforts should be meaningless, but they weren't. When Bierman analyzed the data, he found that the ones and zeros had shifted in the direction the subjects had intended after the fact. It was as if the act of conscious intention reached into the past, influencing something that should have already been set in stone. Seth explained this decades earlier. He suggested that time is not linear but multidimensional, that the past, present and future exist simultaneously. If this is true, then the mind is not bound by time. It can influence events that have already occurred, just as easily as it can shape what is yet to come. This raises a staggering possibility. Is consciousness the true architect of reality? If Seth is right, then what we call objective reality is not fixed. It is shaped, moment by our beliefs, expectations and intentions. And if that is true, then nothing, not even the past, is set in stone. If psychokinesis shows us that consciousness influences matter, then presentiment suggests that consciousness is not bound by time. We assume that time flows in one direction, past, present, future. But what if the body itself experiences time differently? What if, beneath the surface of conscious awareness, your body is already reacting to events that haven't happened yet? This isn't speculation. It has been demonstrated in controlled laboratory conditions. Dean Radin conducted a series of presentiment experiments designed to test whether the body reacts to emotionally charged events before they occur. Here's how it worked. A subject sat in front of a blank screen connected to electrodes that measured galvanic skin response, a biological marker of emotional arousal similar to what's used in lie detector tests. They pressed a button, a computer randomly selected an image, either something neutral like a landscape or something highly emotional, such as violent imagery, medical trauma, or erotica. The key part, the selection was random. There was no way for the subject to know in advance which type of image would appear, and yet their bodies knew. 4 seconds before an emotionally intense image appeared, the subject's skin conductance would spike. Their autonomic nervous system was already reacting before the image even appeared on the screen. The more intense the upcoming image, the stronger the body's reaction. This was not anticipation, not inference. Something else was happening. This experiment has been replicated many times in different labs. The conclusion? Some part of us is constantly scanning the future, preparing the body to respond before an event actually happens. Seth spoke about this ability long before these experiments were conducted. He explained that the body, at the cellular level, is precognitive. The cells are not trapped in linear time. They perceive future probabilities and adjust accordingly. This may explain why people sometimes get an unshakable feeling of dread before disaster strikes, why some people suddenly cancel a flight that later crashes, or why animals flee an area minutes before an earthquake. If this is true, then time is not what we think it is. And if we can learn to tap into this ability consciously, it could change everything about how we navigate the world. But if the body can perceive the future, could it also communicate across space? Telepathy is often dismissed as pure fantasy, an invention of fiction, not science. But what if it's not just possible, but happening at a biological level all the time. Seth described the body as a network of communicating intelligence, where every cell is not only aware of the whole, but is in constant communication with all other cells, even those that have been removed from the body. This is exactly what Cleve Baxter, a former polygraph expert, discovered in his experiments with white blood cells. Baxter took white blood cells from a subject's mouth and placed them in a dish, keeping them alive in a culture. He then moved the dish miles away and monitored the electrical activity of the cells using a polygraph machine. Meanwhile, the subject was shown emotionally intense images, things designed to provoke a strong reaction. And astonishingly, at the exact moment the subject experienced an emotional response, the distant white blood cells reacted as well. It was as if the cells were still connected to their original host, reacting instantly across miles of distance. Even when placed inside a Faraday cage, a shielded enclosure that blocks all known forms of electromagnetic communication, the connection remained. This suggests that the mechanism behind this communication is not electromagnetic. It is something else entirely. Seth anticipated this research by explaining that all cells are linked through a deeper field of awareness, one that is instantaneous and non-local. If this is true, then telepathy is not just possible, it is fundamental. It is something the body does naturally, at a level beneath conscious awareness. But if telepathy can occur at the cellular level, what happens when an entire organ is transplanted into a new body? For centuries, science has assumed that personality, memory, and identity reside exclusively within the brain. The nervous system, we are told, is the sole repository of experience, encoding a lifetime of thoughts, emotions, and desires within the intricate web of neurons and synapses. And yet, what happens when a heart, the very organ that has long been associated with love, passion, and vitality, is transferred from one person to another? Can a transplanted heart carry not only blood, but the very essence of the individual who once lived with it? The notion that memories or personality traits might persist beyond the confines of the brain challenges everything we assume about consciousness. But if Seth's teachings hold true, that consciousness is not localized, that every cell is aware, and that memory is stored throughout the body, then such an idea is not only possible but inevitable. Take, for instance, the story of Claire Sylvia, a dancer and choreographer who underwent a heart-lung transplant at Yale New Haven Hospital in 1988. Upon waking from surgery, she was overwhelmed by an inexplicable craving for chicken nuggets, an indulgence she had never enjoyed. More puzzling still, she found herself drawn to cool blues and greens, abandoning the fiery reds and oranges she had once favored. Her demeanor shifted as well. She became more aggressive, impulsive, more like the young man whose heart now beat within her chest. Later, she discovered that her donor, a teenager named Tim, had been found with uneaten Kentucky Fried Chicken nuggets in his jacket at the time of his death. From a perspective like Seth's, this makes perfect sense. Seth often described the body consciousness as a complex, multi-dimensional awareness, a gestalt of cellular intelligence that integrates memory, emotion, and physical form. Unlike the ego, which perceives time in a linear fashion, the cells exist within simultaneous time, retaining the imprint of every experience they have ever encountered. When an organ is transplanted, it does not simply integrate into a new biological system, it brings with it the memory of the donor's experience, encoded at the cellular level. The case of Danny and Paul provides an even deeper glimpse into this phenomenon. An 18-year-old girl named Danny received a heart transplant from an 18-year-old boy named Paul, a musician and poet who had died suddenly in an accident. After the surgery, Danny's personality underwent an undeniable transformation. She felt an overwhelming connection to music, particularly the guitar, an instrument she had never played before. One evening, she met Paul's grieving parents, who revealed that their son had been a songwriter. They handed her one of his unfinished compositions titled "Danny, My Heart Is Yours," a song about how he felt he was destined to die and give his heart to someone. Danny immediately recognized the melody and could finish the phrases of his songs. "I never played before," she later reported, "but after my transplant I had to. It was in my heart. Paul is serenading me. How could he know years before he died that he would die and give his heart to me? How would he know my name is Danny? Seth often remarked that the self is not a singular enclosed entity but a vast multidimensional reality that extends beyond time and space. Within this framework, physical memory is only one aspect of a much larger tapestry. What we call individuality is fluid, capable of merging, splitting and reforming across lifetimes and experiences. In this light, Danny's experience suggests that Paul's consciousness had in some way continued within her, even after his death. His heart, still pulsing with the rhythms of his former life, had retained a trace of his being, but it is not only emotional and creative traits that appear to survive transplantation. Some recipients report an overwhelming sense of connection to their donor's past trauma, as though the body itself had absorbed the shock of their final moments. A woman who received the heart of a young accident victim described recurring nightmares of a violent car crash. She could feel the impact in her chest, but the doctors assured her that everything looked fine. Her new aversion to meat, which had once been a dietary staple, aligned perfectly with her donor's lifelong vegetarianism. This aligns with Seth's assertion that the body is not merely a machine, but a living consciousness, deeply responsive to belief, expectation, and experience. If the cells retain the emotional and sensory imprints of their previous host, then it follows that a transplanted heart so intimately connected to the rhythms of life and death might still echo with its donor's last sensations. Even more compelling is the case of Carter, a young boy who received the heart of another child, Jerry, who had drowned in a bathtub. From the moment Carter met Jerry's mother, a physician, he ran to her, pressing his nose against hers in an unmistakably familiar gesture. Jerry's mother. It was exactly what Jerry used to do. When Carter hugged me, I felt my son. Not just symbolically, he was there. From a conventional medical standpoint, such cases are baffling, but through the lens of Seth's teachings, they become not only possible, but expected. The body is not a passive vessel. It is an intricate system of awareness, constantly exchanging information with the greater reality in which it exists. If the heart carries memory, not just biologically but energetically, then the presence of the donor within the recipient is not a ghostly haunting, but a continuation of consciousness in another form. One of the most eerie accounts comes from a professor who received the heart of a police officer who had been shot in the face. Shortly after the transplant, he began experiencing inexplicable flashes of light in his vision. Hallucinations, the doctors assumed, caused by medication. Yet the donor's widow later revealed that her husband's final moment had been a blinding gunshot to the head. The recipient had no knowledge of this, and yet night after night he found himself reliving the last thing his donor had seen. If we accept Seth's premise that the body exists within simultaneous time, constantly reaching both forward and backward, then this is not so much a memory as it is an echo, a lingering vibration of trauma preserved in the transplanted cells. So what does this mean for our understanding of identity? The prevailing materialist model insists that memory, personality, and consciousness are functions of the brain alone. But if that were true, then how could a transplanted heart carry the imprints of its former owner? The answer, from a Sethian perspective, is clear. Consciousness is not confined to the brain. It is woven into every cell, every organ, every structure of the body. And if that is the case, then the boundaries between self and other, life and death, past and present, may be far more fluid than we have ever imagined, which raises a fascinating question. If human hearts carry memory, what happens when we transplant an animal's heart into a human? In 2022, doctors at the University of Maryland successfully transplanted a pig's heart into a human patient, a historic first in the field of xenotransplantation. This raises a profound question. If a human heart carries memory and personality, will an animal heart do the same? Will recipients of non-human organs develop new instincts? Will they experience changes in behavior, emotion, or cognition? And if so, what does that mean for the nature of consciousness itself? If memory can be transferred beyond the brain, then consciousness is not confined to neurons. It is distributed, it is embedded in every living system. And if it is embedded in the body, it is likely embedded everywhere. Microchimerism is a natural biological phenomenon where cells from one human being become permanently integrated into another human's body. It happens most commonly during pregnancy, where fetal cells migrate across the placenta into the mother's body and stay there for life. And it turns out that these cells don't just stay in the mother's blood, they cross into her brain where they develop into neurons. Which means that long after giving birth, a mother is literally carrying living cells from her child inside her brain. This could explain why some mothers experience a telepathic-like connection to their children, why they sometimes feel an intuitive sense of distress even when separated by great distances. If Seth is correct, then microchimerism is more than biology. It is a physical manifestation of consciousness itself, binding generations together through living consciousness. Each of these phenomena tells us something profound. Consciousness is not confined to the brain. It reaches into the past, it bends the future, it communicates across space and time. It is embedded in every cell, every organ, every living system. And if consciousness exists beyond the skull, beyond time, beyond the limits we once believed in, then what else might it be capable of? The question is not whether consciousness is real. The question is, are we ready to accept what that means? And if so, what comes next? Join us next time as we continue to delve into the fascinating world of biological psi phenomena, or biopsi. We'll take a look at the placebo response, species-level learning, and the mystery of protein folding. Until then, like and subscribe, and share your views in the comments below. Thank you all for watching.